Welcome to the lecture on our last chapter in our text on contemporary or postmodern society. We're going to look at late modernism in the 20th century. We're going to go through World War II. We're going to look at the rise of existentialism. We're going to see how technology and postmodernism forms. We're going to see new ways of looking at ourselves through science. And we're going to see the development of a lot of medias in literature, in film, and we're going to cover a lot of ground. Obviously, you could spend an entire semester on what we're about to study here. And like most books that are the types of books that we're looking at, where we're looking at kind of the beginning of history all the way through up till now, chapters on the Renaissance, for example, are probably not going to change very much. That history is pretty stable. Writing a history about what's important in our civilization as we cycle through different news stories is really hard to pin down and might not be best written until 25, 50 years from now. So what they often do in the last chapters of contemporary history is they just kind of throw stuff at the wall, and maybe it sticks, maybe it's important, maybe it's not. We get into the 21st century and kind of generalities, but mostly we're looking pretty concretely at the 20th century, and that we kind of know how to see it, how to box it, and how to make it into a history. This textbook, I think, is probably going to come out with a new version of it, the sixth version, and it'll probably get more into the last few years. What is it to live in a post-pandemic society? How have politics formed our government? The rise of China, maybe more concretely. In this last version of the book, we see things like terrorism, really dealing with 9/11 from the beginning of the 21st century, the rise of China as a rival superpower, both economically and militarily. So how are all of these things going to affect our world? Certainly things like climate change. These are things that we're living in and through, and I think it's hard to pinpoint it down to what are the most important attributes if you're going to do 5, 10 pages trying to kind of cover everything. How do you cover the last 23 years? That is still to be written, but it doesn't mean that writers aren't making an attempt at it. So I want to go over the chapter. Then I want to present a lecture on otherness and the uncanny valley. In this summer class, I have an extra credit assignment. If this is a spring or fall class, it'll probably be a mandatory discussion. And then I have extra credit assignment here on rock and roll. I have other assignments that I might have in other classes that include a history of hip hop, that include K-pop and J-pop, that include cartoons or memes, and I have all these different options that might be extra credit assignments in other classes. And the way that you'll know it is not from looking at the lecture here in front of you, but by going to your modules and seeing in your particular class, in your particular year, what do you have on the module schedule in your final week. Okay, let's get into the chapter on globalism, information communication, and the digital revolution. So, our text begins with this photograph by Andreas Gursky, Pangyang 1. This is the Arirang Festival that is in North Korea, which is run under a communist dictatorship. It is a yearly pageant, yearly spectacle, I think unrivaled in the West. 50,000 acrobats, 30,000 school children using flip cards with mosaic patterns in the background, all mythologizing and creating a history of the founding of the current regime of North Korea. It is a amazing synchronized movement of tens of thousands of people that not only shows the beauty of people all being in lockstep together, but also definitely has militaristic implications, which make it also frightening at the same time. Photographer Gursky, he does these massive photographs, and in the photographs, he's neither idealizing what's going on here or criticizing it. He is simply finding engaging images for us to look at. So, globalism is a condition of interdependence between all parts of the world that was forged in technology and mass communication over the last 6 decades. Electronic modes of communication shrunk the planet, creating a global village, as Marshall McLuhan once called it, in which images and ideas are instantaneously and universally shared. Every new development, technologically, politically, financially, and culturally, potentially affects every other part of our global village. Globalism has accelerated the shift from elitist modernism in the early 20th century to populist postmodernism of the late 20th century. The United States took the lead in the arts in the period following World War II, and the rest of the planet shared in a wealth of new style of literature, visual arts, in music and film, anti-colonial and Cold War conflicts, existentialism, feminism, the quest for racial, ethnic, and gender identity, and massive information explosions facilitated by digital technology are among the major developments in the last 50 to 70 years. A global quest for personal freedom, a passion for experimentation, and a fascination with the infinite potential of digital technology remain driving forces in our society. While these developments have been largely positive in nature, new issues challenge us in the 21st century in terms of the health of our environment, the dangers of international terrorism, and it's really too soon to know exactly how all of these are going to shape us. So, post-World War II and the types of world that is being developed. So, one of the things that we are beginning to see is the end of colonialism. So, after the end of World War II and the forces that destroy the Nazis and also the imperialism of the Japanese, we have new coalitions that are forming in the world that are creating a Cold War. So in this Cold War, we have the Soviet bloc that took over Eastern European countries adjacent to Russia, and also we have the governments in North Korea and also in China that have opposed the West and especially opposed the kind of united front of the imperialism that it was going on in the United States. In this Cold War, we have a new world that is divided up after the Korean conflict, and we have the two superpowers that are kind of dividing each other, each one with nuclear capabilities. So we have a number of wars that develop after World War II, like the Korean conflict, and mostly these wars are not fought by nuclear-armed countries. They are fought by territories that are looking for protection from one of these nuclear-armed countries. Korea is split in two by a war, and the Vietnam conflict from 64 to 73 also is first dividing the country of Vietnam, and then ultimately the communist forces will take over Vietnam. We have various revolutions that are going on, and in these revolutions, we are seeing cultural revolutions in China, and these cultural revolutions are setting up, again, new kind of governments and new kinds of powers, cults of personality like around Chairman Mao, and the Cultural Revolution, trying to erase the history of China to create something new. We also see the beginning of decolonialization after World War II, where the colonies in Africa and in Asia are breaking away from the roots of Europe. And this is being led, of course, in India by Mahatma Gandhi. He is a lawyer and anti-colonial nationalist who employed nonviolent resistance and leads a campaign for India's independence from British rule. India will partition itself from a majority of Hindu to a majority of Muslim, who will create a sovereign nation out of northwest India called Pakistan. In philosophy, we have a kind of pessimism that forms after World War II that we see in existentialism that is led by a writer named Jean-Paul Sartre. Sartre argues that there's no pre-existing blueprint for human beings, no essence that we must conform to. He is challenging the fundamental tradition that Plato had set up for us of some sort of essence of unchanging eternal forms or ideas. Aristotle believes that reason is an essential attribute that separates human beings from lower animals. Western philosopher from Descartes to Kant held that internal principles of being preceded being itself, a view metaphysically comparable with Christian theology. Sartre disagrees. Sartre believes that human existence precedes essence. We choose to become what we become. We have no fixed nature. We are not imbued with any special divinity, nor are we any sort of rational beings. We are neither imprisoned by unconscious forces, as Freud thinks, nor are we determined by specific economic conditions, as Marx maintains. We are born into the world as body and matter, and we proceed to make the choices which form our own natures. In his analysis, each individual is the sum of his, her, or their actions, and we must choose at every turn between a variety of possibilities. We are condemned to be free. And this, Sartre says, creates an anguish, a despair as we seek meaning in a meaningless world. How can there be meaning after Auschwitz? According to Sartre, a human condition is one of anxiety experienced in the face of nothingness and the inevitability of death. Such anxiety is compounded because we alone are responsible for our actions. Sartre writes a play where we get the kind of existential hero. In No Exit, he features three characters trapped in a hell that they have created, and their efforts to justify acts of bad faith that have shaped their lives. They are stuck in this room. They are probably dead in a type of hell. There is a type of kind of literary hero formed here, deprived of traditional values and religious beliefs, who bears the burden of freedom, total responsibility of their actions. The existential hero, or more exactly the anti-hero, takes up a quest for meaning. Alienated by nature and circumstance, they make choices in a world lacking moral absolutes, in a world in which no act might be called good unless it is chosen in conscious preference to its alternatives. Unlike the heroes of old, the modern anti-hero neither noble nor sure of purpose. They might act decisively, but with full recognition of the absence of shared cultural values and moral absolutes, trapped rather than liberated by those freedoms. They might have trouble getting along with others or simply making it through the day. Hell, says one of Sartre's characters in No Exit, hell is other people. Simone de Beauvoir is another existentialist writer. She is talking about the second sex, about women, and calling upon women to have a moral revolution, saying that the woman who is supposed to be the other or the antithesis of male, a male who is full of action and aggressiveness and in control of their life, that women being passive to men and being the other to men is something that women are choosing and is not inherent to their nature. We see the existentialist hero in the theater of the absurd, abandoning classical theater from Sophocles and Shakespeare through Ibsen and Miller. Absurdist playwrights are rejecting dramatic structure and are maybe more inspired by Dada performance and surrealist film. In Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot, first staged in 1952, the main action of the play consists of a running dialogue, terse, repetitive, often comical, between two tramps as they await a mysterious Godot, who, despite their anxious expectations, never arrives. The progress of the play is embellished by an extraordinary blend of biblical allusions, broad slapstick, comic wordplay, Zen-like propositions, and crude jokes. Literary critics find in Godot a symbol of salvation, revelation, or more commonly God, an interpretation that the writer himself rejects. Nevertheless, an absent deliverer, or because of that absence, gives a modicum of meaning to the lives of the central characters. In art, we have abstract expressionism. We have also, in abstract expressionism, we have artists like Giacometti, who predates abstract expressionism, who is giving us kind of an essence of a human rather than detailed humans in his sculpture. Abstract expressionism is the first major style of art to start in America, in New York City after 1945. The pioneers of the movement are artists like Jackson Pollock and also Mark Rothko. In Jackson Pollock, we get the action painters. That is made by dripping paint on the floor rather than painting on a wall, a type of seductive handwriting mingled with sand and nails and matches and bottle shards, and creating a art of no narrative, that the artist walks around and walks in and is more inspired by Navajo sand painting than other Western forms. In Mark Rothko, we get large-scale heroic ambitions in color that seems to glow from within in his color-field paintings. In our quest for equality, we have the end of colonialism, a quest for racial equality. In the South, we have the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement. And we see from the beginning of America, when the Dutch bring the first slaves of America, until the end of slavery, and with the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 to the liberation of slaves in 1865, that millions of black Americans remain an underprivileged minority living in an advanced industrial state and separated by segregation. And we begin to see the movement of civil rights between 1955 and 1968 that is ultimately codified by the federal government, ensuring equal rights. These equal rights are hard fought for by people like Dr. Martin Luther King, who is a Protestant pastor and civil rights activist, modeling his campaigns of peaceful protests on Gandhi from India. He is urging us, as he was confined in jail for marching without a permit in the city of Birmingham, addressing a group of local white clergy who had criticized him for breaking laws that prohibit blacks from using public facilities that are for whites only. He is saying in Birmingham jail that he is a believer in civil disobedience as a means of opposing injustice. Like Henry Thoreau earlier that we studied, you should not follow unjust laws simply because they are laws. In art, we are seeing in artists like Faith Ringgold, we are seeing black perspective in art and how black identity is being formed by outside forces like racism, and yet how black people are maintaining their own hopes and dreams and dignity alive while being Americans. We see this in literature like The Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison. And we are also seeing other forms of the black struggle coming from people like Malcolm X, who believes that the struggle of nonviolence does not work in a violent society, and that people really are only going to listen to you if you fight back. He also is talking about having a separate black identity and the mission of keeping a separate black identity, that black people and their culture should, in the quest to end racial segregation, not be absorbed by this other culture. There's a quest for gender equality in feminism that reaches back, as we have seen, in the early 14th century to French poet Christine de Pizan, who is defending women, Mary Wollstonecraft, and also we are seeing other people writing like The Subjugation of Women from British intellectual John Stuart Mill, and that the subordination of woman is wrong in itself. There is a suffragette movement in the 1920s that allow women to vote once again. The perception of women inferior to men is something that women are fighting, a women majority with limited power. In feminism, we have equal rights, social, political, and economic rights that they're fighting for. And that writer Virginia Woolf is saying that in an essay, A Room for One's Own, that a woman needs to secure her own creative freedom. She must have money and privacy in her own physical space. In The Second Sex, written in 1949 by Simone de Beauvoir, the existentialist, she is dethroning the myth of femininity and saying that the feminine essence condemns one to become the social and intellectual subordinates of men, and she is defining women as the other, and they should renounce that. In the 1960s, the National Organization of Women is trying to raise gender consciousness and broaden political and economic opportunities for women. The Feminine Mystique, written in 1963 by Betty Friedan, claims that American society in general and commercial advertising in particular brainwashes women to prefer the roles of wives and mothers to other careers. In feminist art and writing, we have art like we see here from Judy Chicago. In female issues, we are finding three recurring motifs: the victimization of the female, her effort to define her role in male-dominated society, and her displacement from the ancient status of goddess. In art by Judy Chicago, in her dinner party, we are seeing a collaboration with women who are making ceramic place settings for 39 important women in history in a symbol of an upside down triangle, the pubic bone, and the pubic symbol that we had been seeing since the Paleolithic era. And these place settings resemble vaginas and vulvas, as well as fruit and vegetables. And we are seeing 39 women in history, as well as 999 women inscribed in gold and white tile floor below the triangle, who maybe have been important in history but have been left out of history books. From Barbara Kruger, she reminds us that your body is a battleground, using the techniques of advertising and appropriation art, borrowing elements from other forms. She is showing us a photo using the typeface Futura in a red line rule, reminding women that your body is not necessarily yours. Your body is consistently legislated in terms of what you can and can't do about it. And certainly the overturning of Roe versus Wade in the 2020s has certainly shown us that that is still true. There is also a search for sexual and gender identity. We are seeing now a distinct from sex, a biologically determined construct that designates an individual at birth as either male or female, and gender, which is culturally determined. So you perform gender, you perform how you want to behave in terms of the expected roles that society sets up for you. So there's a number of reasons that human sexuality becomes so visible in the late 20th century. Number one is the increased sexual permissiveness and the consequence of effective pharmaceutical methods for contraception. Number two is the activity of media, especially in television and film, and broadcasting sexually explicit entertainment. And then also we have the incidence of AIDS, acquired immune deficiency syndrome, among male homosexuals in the United States, resulting in a number of deaths that devastated many parts of the world and still does today. And collectively, these phenomena led to an impact on traditional concepts of gender, sexual behavior, and conventional morality. The gay liberation movement is part of this, with the Stonewall Inn Rebellion in 1969, where gay men call for the protection from harassment from the police and other people and demand social equality, including the possibility of marriage. We see also the quest for ethnic identity, a multidimensional phenomenon in a cluster of traits that include gender, race, language, physical appearance, and also religious values. The self-referring significance of ethnic identity, and expressed in an ancient Yoruban proverb, I am because we are, I am is what we are, perceiving oneself as a group. In our photograph here by Persian artist Sharir Nezhat, Rebellious Silence, from the Women of Allah series in 1994. This is a silver gelatin print, and her photographs deal with ethnic and feminist issues in the Muslim world, especially in her native Iran. Her photographic series, Women of Allah, addresses the role of militant Muslim women who fought in the 1979 revolution and overthrew Iran's ruling dynasty. She's making dramatic use of the veil, a large square of black cloth known as the chador, to isolate her face, which, intersected by a rifle, is a site of a poem by Iran's most famous modern female poet, transcribed in Farsi calligraphy. We also see, in America especially, Hispanic immigrants, Latinos, and with Latinos we see a great amount of art that I showed you in our Chapter 9 lecture of art from Mesoamerica, and in particular I showed you many articles including Maro Ibarra and also Carla Diaz, who are showing exactly how ethnic identity of being Latino operates in American culture. In science and philosophy, we are advancing into investigations into outer space and inner space because of new technology. In string theory and chaos theory, we have a belief that vibrating strings are multidimensional, and these strings and oscillating globules of matter unite all creation into vibrating patterns. According to string theory, the universe has extra dimensions curled up in a complex manifold of space. The workings of such a universe, invisible to the naked eyes, can be simulated only on a computer. Language other than the language of higher mathematics fails to serve as an explanation. In other words, you can no longer be sure that you can observe the universe to understand the universe. And the idea that you can understand things rationally by observation become something that doesn't necessarily explain how phenomenon works. In chaos theory, we find universal patterns that underlie all nature and repeat themselves in physical phenomenon, ranging from the snowflake pattern to rhythms of the human heart. Chaos theorists also observe that while patterns appear random, unstable, and disorderly, they are actually self-similar in scale, like the zigs and zags of a lightning bolt or the oscillations of electric currents. To Einstein's famous assertion, God does not play dice with the universe, these theorists might respond, not only does God play dice, but the dice is loaded. The Human Genome Project. So the human genome was mapped out by the year 2000 by molecular biologists who, with the help of computers, were able to ascertain the order of nearly 3 billion units of DNA, locating genes that determine their functions in the human cellular system. Ultimately, the enterprise revolutionizes the practice of medicine in the preventive treatment of gene-related disorders, the diagnosis and prediction of hereditary diseases. The tools of genetic engineering have given scientists the ability to clone life forms. In language, we find from Wittgenstein that all forms of expression are indeed truths, are subject to the underlying structure of the language used to convey them. He argues that language represents the world, and sentences or propositions were pictures of reality. His groundbreaking philosophy leads to the publication of 2 important texts, and after him, philosophers try to unlock the meaning of the text, that they are analyzing the structure, and that Jacques Derrida believes that one must deconstruct or take apart discourse in order to unmask the meaning of the text. In Of Grammatology from 1967, Derrida examined the relationship between speech and writing and their roles in the effectiveness of language. In Michel Foucault's The Archaeology of Knowledge, he suggested that language is not a servant, but the master of those who use it. The information explosion. In the information age, we have agents of high technology and mass media and electronic means of communicating, storing, and accessing information. Televisions and computers are the primary vehicles of the information explosion, have altered almost every aspect of human life. TV originally transmitted sound and light by ways of electromagnetic waves that sent information instantaneously to homes across the face of the earth. By the 1960s, the wars in Vietnam are being relayed by electronic communications. In 1990, we have the first primetime war with the war in Kuwait against the Iraqis. And we have seen digital television now become the prime mode and the prime vehicle on digital computers and machines that begin in the 1960s. We are finding artificial forms of intelligence and virtual reality. Media is shaping globalism. Marshall McLuhan was talking about that in the Gutenberg Galaxy in 1962. He believes that communication shrunk the distances between inhabitants to create a global village. We have the first online nonprofit English language encyclopedia in Wikipedia that was launched in 2001. And here we are looking at art by from the Katai girl, who is wearing cell phones and keypads and wires, and is showing us a type of art that is done, that Noriko Yamaguchi is wearing, that is showing us a human as a piece of global communication. We are our communication is what's being said in her performance. Really good video, you should check it out. In postmodernism, postmodernism is a term that is characterized by a bemused awareness of the past whose reality is processed by mass media and information technology. Postmodern artists appropriate or borrow pre-existing texts and images from history, advertising, and the media. They offer alternatives to the high seriousness and introversion of modernist expression and move instead to parody, imitation, paradox, and irony, and are more playful and are breaking down the differences between high and low art, as we see the appropriation of Manet's Olympia, a painting from the realist in 1865, done as a photograph by Yasumasa Morimura in 1988, where he is playing the prostitute, a European as a Japanese person, and the painting has now been turned completely into a photograph, and he is playing both roles in this photograph. In contemporary literature, writers are exploring literary styles and genres. They are breaking apart kind of traditional forms of realism, but there are three major kind of categories that we find in postmodern fiction, docu-fiction, and magic realism. In postmodern fiction, we find the gallows humor of Kurt Vonnegut in the very popular Slaughterhouse-Five, a satirical novel that turned many against the Vietnam War, launched as a kind of video fiction that resembles commercial television. In Thomas Pynchon's dense masterpiece, Gravity's Rainbow, we have an encyclopedic array of references and puns in world history, chemistry, mathematics, religion, film, and popular music. It becomes the archetype of literary American postmodernism. In Joan Didion, we find docufiction, and also in Thomas Wolfe. They are writing things that have a basis of truth, but writing them with fictitious characters. In The Neuromancer from science fiction, we get a landmark novel in 1984 by William Gibson that is anticipating many of the innovations of the digital era, including genetic engineering and virtual reality, artificial intelligence, computer hacking, and launching a new kind of cyberpunk, and coining the term cyberspace, which is a virtual reality in which complex data is governed by digital systems. In art, we are finding postmodern parody and irony. We are finding multiple meanings and plurality. Here in this photo by conceptual artist Louise Lawler, she is photographing a very important Jackson Pollock painting next to a kind of cheap bowl, a cheap soup bowl, showing the weird superimposition of our abilities to shop and maybe dubious manners of taste that come from having money and buying popular art, and then the kind of furniture and things that you might have in your home. In postmodern art, we find this appropriation, say, from the urinal done by Marcel Duchamp that we saw in chapter 14 to Sherry Levine's version of it. In postmodern art, we find that the art is playful, eccentric, multiple viewpoints, meanings, and references, inspired by pop art and industrial materials, language as art, and involving narratives from the impressed and institutional critique. In art like minimalism, we are seeing the artists get rid of the evidence of their hand whatsoever. And in Donald Judd's Untitles, we are getting rid of any analogy or allegory or connotations. What you see is what it is. The whole idea without any confusion. And the artist is having things fabricated rather than making work on their own. Pop art is glorifying the imagery of consumer products. It is kind of quintessentially the style of the information age. We are inspired by television and advertising and billboards and products, and we are using those things in our art. One of the great artists of this style is Andy Warhol, using advertising techniques like silkscreens to create images of products and Campbell's soup cans and also celebrities. In conceptual art, we are getting a total art driven by ideas and concepts, and we are seeing from them the idea that art is not important as an object or good taste in style. Instead, the idea is everything. Like in Joseph Kosuth's 1 in 3 chairs, where you have a mass-manufactured chair, and then you have an image of a chair and a dictionary definition of a chair. All three are necessary for the chair to exist. So with the chair in the physical world, if it doesn't have a name, it's not a chair. Without a mental template or an image of a chair, you cannot build a chair. So like Plato's forms, where the image precedes reality, we are seeing that again here, but also adding in the notion that language, and perhaps also we could say that consciousness is made up of images and language that also exist simultaneously within the real world too. Artists are getting away from galleries in land art. Here we are looking at a kind of almost Neolithic art like the Nazca Lines or Stonehenge, an earthwork done by Robert Smithson, the spiral jetty, an art that can't be bought or sold, that exists in nature. We see Andy Goldsworthy, a Scottish artist, doing the same thing, going out in nature and making temporary ephemeral artworks. Another form of conceptual art is happening in Alan Karpraw's Happenings, where we are having an art of theater that is not about object, but human experiences and human relationships. In the 1980s, we are getting new forms of painting, like the neo-expressionism of Jean-Michel Basquiat, using forms of street art and scrawling, along with the kind of crude painting that comes from Anselm Kiefer and other neo-expressionistic artists in the 1980s. From Jean-Claude Christo, we are getting another kind of version of total art, as Jean-Claude and Christo are both American artists, transforming natural and human sites with huge amounts of fabric and changing their meaning by putting them in the fabrics. So the Reichstag here in Berlin is reshaped and re-understood as a kind of flattened symbol rather than the details that you would find in this government building. In video art, that begins with Korean artist Namjoon Paik. We are kind of getting the prediction of the television cathode ray would replace the canvas as the medium of the future. We are looking at electronic engineers that are building and designing new ways of viewing the world. Here we're looking at Bill Viola. He is using high-resolution, computer-driven video to film people backwards as they are plunging into water to get a sense of them being born. From Pippi Lottie Rist, We are seeing new forms of video that anyone can have access to. You don't need to have real expensive equipment. She is one of the most important video artists of our age. In one of her earliest videos, we see this really strange video called "I'm Not the Girl Who Misses Much." And in this, she sings over and over with sped up video and sometimes slow down a line from the Beatles song that she then dances to and moves to. And we're not sure, but it appears that as the girl who doesn't miss much, it appears that her breasts are showing also. And we get kind of a sense that art can also be a little bit annoying as well as kind of being silly and juvenile. And again, what is high and low art? Olafur Eliasson is doing great things with installations, in particular the weather project here, where we inside appear to have a dying sun and a polluted world with mono-frequency lights that are only allowing us to see in yellows and oranges, and a sense kind of he is anticipating perhaps the world that is coming before us. In postmodern architecture, we are moving away from the modern style and the international style, the austerity of it, into playful forms, like we are getting from the Sony Tower, the AT&T building, that looks like it is perhaps more furniture than architecture. Frank Gehry is using computers to figure out tensile strength and how to cut materials with CNC machine to make buildings look as if they're twisting and being folded. The book Learning from Las Vegas is teaching us that perhaps the most important architecture is in Las Vegas, and that more playful forms of architecture maybe reflect us more in our media selves. Santiago Calatrava, he is on the cover of our textbook. Here we're looking at the transit hub that he created in New York City that looks like an abstraction of a kind of bird in flight, an immobilized stegosaurus, and is something that has minimalistic qualities to it, but also he's able to do it because of computer technology that allows him to figure out very complex forms of engineering. A lot of things happening in music. Much of this is going on because of John Cage, a spokesman of experimentation. He's describing music as a combination of silence and sounds. He composes 4 minutes and 33 seconds, where a pianist sits at a piano getting ready to play, but does not play the music. And while this is going on, you hear sound. He is inspired by Zen Buddhism, the I Ching, the Chinese book of changes that we saw in our first chapter, and kind of what's going on in Dada and Surrealism. We are getting new forms of music like microtonality and minimalism from Gregory Ligeti. Also, American composer Philip Glass is creating minimalist music, stripped down music with repeated subtle rhythmic patterns. Here is an example here of it. Again, I can't play too much because this stuff is really monitored on YouTube. So notice you're not getting the sweeping highs and lows of Beethoven and romantic music here. This would be the soundtrack of the movie 2001: A Space Odyssey, this kind of music. Kind of microtonality, clusters of sound. We are getting a play of minimalism in dance and also in theater in the musical drama Einstein on the Beach, which Philip Glass is producing in collaboration with the designer and director Robert Williams. Einstein on the Beach combines instrumental and vocal music, recitation, mime, and dance, but departs from any operatic traditions in its lack of narrative storyline. Performed with no intermission over a period of 4.5 hours, it is not an account of Einstein's life or work, but an extended poetic statement whose harmonic changes occur so slowly that one must, as Glass explains, listen to learn in a different speed. We have an experience that more closely resembles an act of meditation, and dance that has qualities of humans as machines. Here's a little bit of it here. We are also in music seeing the effects of the computer and electronic methods that are able to capture and reverse and slow down instrumentation, and then also to sample and record things as well. So you can modify sounds, you can play it backwards, you can change the speeds, and now the computer can generate and also reproduce those images too. Also important is new musical forms inspired by jazz in rock and roll. In rock and roll, we are getting dynamics of sound that are fast, hard rhythms, strong beats, colloquial lyrics relating to earlier forms of music like soul, rhythm and blues, the gospel tradition, and we see this in forms of the electronic guitar as well as forms that are using instruments from jazz and big band. Here we're going to see Little Richard doing a little bit of Tutti Frutti, and you get a sense of the energy that is going on in rock and roll music.
She's the gal that I love, man. Tutti Frutti, oh Rudy. 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 Bop, bop, loom, bop, lump, bump, bum. I got a gal named Daisy. She almost drives me crazy. Got a gal named Daisy. She almost drives me crazy. She knows how to love me, yes indeed.
And we have also seen black music as it has become absorbed in rock and roll. We get to hip hop, which is a combination of electronically mixed and manipulated music, jarring lyrics, a new form of dancing called b-boying, a acrobatic dance style that comes from the Bronx and becomes a kind of call and response chant that is influenced by disco and reggae and rock and rap, which is an offshoot of hip hop that is born in Black America's urban youth culture and the most important musical style in pop music right now. Rock and roll music becomes canonized in Woodstock in the 1960s, where it becomes a political form, but also making large amounts of money in live music, and of course the recorded music on vinyl that ultimately has led to recorded digital computer music also dominates our culture. I would say that music, especially pop music in rock and hip hop and dance, is the most important art form that everybody uses and everybody shares today, and I think shows that art generally is quite minor in comparison. And the last thing that I want to share with music is Laurie Anderson. In Laurie Anderson, we are seeing a type of composer who is experimenting as a performance artist, who is working in synthesis and experimental music, and is known very little outside of the art world for a song called Oh Superman. And in Oh Superman, we see a kind of experimental, minimalist music that is performed but also has the implication of being digitally altered. Here's a little bit of Oh Superman.
Oh, mom and dad, mom and dad, hi, I'm not home right now, but if you want to leave a message, just start talking at the sound of the tone.
So there is a mixture of kind of high art and low art happening there, right? With she's using forms of popular music, but it also really is kind of abstract and artistic at the same time. So the last thing that our chapter kind of goes into is what are we dealing with in the 21st century? And it's talking about things like how we're responding to terrorism, China's global ascendance, how we are often now interactive spectators in media, not just passive spectators. And it ends talking about the multi-million-dollar art market. I imagine in the future it will be talking about the effects of the pandemic. It'll be talking about the effects of the internet in relationship to political discourse and the challenging things that are happening in democracy too. But again, those are things that are happening, not are historically solidified yet, like the things that I've talked about in the lecture. The next thing that I want to share with you here is a lecture that is titled kind of a panacea here of otherness. I talked a little bit about otherness in relationship to Simone de Beauvoir and how in all societies there is a dissimilar and opposite to the self, of us, of a group. The other is perceived by the group as not belonging, being different in some fundamental way, and any stranger has the potential to become the other. The group sees itself as the norm and judge those that do not meet the norm, who are different in any way, as the other. Forms of otherness may be different race, different nationality, different religion, different gender, social class, political ideology, sexual orientation, different origins. Simone de Beauvoir is setting out to let women know that they are allowing themselves to be the other to men and are being passive, are being opposite, are allowing the performance of their gender to leave them as kind of second-class citizens compared to men. She is looking at other myths where women are demonized, like Pandora, who opens up a box that lets all the ills of the world out, that too often we find that women are seen in myths as something dangerous. And this is what she's telling women not to be, to resist the temptation to remain inferior by acting docile, complacent, or infantile. In Faith Wilding, we find a woman in her performance at Woman House, where she is influenced by Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot, and that what women are always doing is waiting in society, and that waiting is a sign that you are the other. Bell Hooks is looking at otherness through writing about intersectionality and saying that you can't just study race or capitalism or gender. You have to study them all because they are all interrelated. In Ain't I a Woman, she is letting us know that black women really don't fit into feminism because it was mostly about white women, and they also don't really fit into the civil rights movement, which was mainly about the liberation of black men. So black women are kind of marginalized in both of these movements. And she is the genius that comes up with writing in ways that anyone can understand, but also the notion of intersectionality, which, if you pay attention to classes that you're in, you'll hear this term intersectionality quite a bit. That is a basis for thinking about how we put together all of these subjects, and really what the essence of our study of the humanities has been all semester. I begin to get into otherness in terms of machine in the discussion here. And I cite Donna Haraway's Cyborg Manifesto. It's a feminist manifesto that is criticizing binaries, that no such thing exists as either man or woman, that we are somewhere all in between, and that technology means that the ideas of essentialism no longer need to exist. Women can be just as powerful as men. They don't need to be just baby factories taking care of the home. And that we are all cyborgs. It's no such thing as man versus machine. If you're wearing glasses, you have a technology. You're viewing this lecture through a computer. In sports, we have PEDs. We have images of sonograms where we first see babies being born. The first time we see a baby's image is not when they're born anymore. It's from a computer-generated image. We are surrounded by these networks, and we are defined by these networks. We are defined by technology. We are all part cyborg. We're also somewhat scared by this computer technology, of the singularity, of the time when artificial intelligence becomes so sophisticated that it achieves some sort of complex consciousness, and that in this consciousness they begin to overtake us, and they find that the human beings are disposable and no longer necessary for a computerized world. In the philosophy of transhumanism, there is a lot of debate about what does it mean to be human? How much human needs to exist? What if you were able to take your consciousness and put it on a hard drive, and when your body died, they were able to download your consciousness into a new body or grow a new body for you? How much of you needs to remain for you to be you? Is you defined by your living arms and limbs, or is you defined by something else? Transhumanism, I think, is one of the more interesting philosophic debates going on. So we see this notion of artificial intelligence and a dangerous other existing in media all the time, that we are being driven to kind of have fear of AI in our medias. And what I want you to look at in our discussion is the uncanny valley. I have a couple of videos that I want to show you. The uncanny valley is identified by robotics professor Masahiro Mori in 1970. Here he is here. Here is the robot of him, uncanny and so close to him that it makes us uncomfortable. We also see that in popular film as well. If you look at the Blade Runner films, you also see this idea of the difference between what is real life and what is life that is purely electronic. In a really interesting film from the 1970s that I'm going to mention here, in the film Watermelon Man, we see a black actor directed by Melvin Van Peebles. Godfrey Cambridge plays the role of Jeff Gerber. He is a white executive working as he's kind of a boorish personality with kids and a housewife. And then one day he wakes up and he's black. And he has become literally the other. And he's fired from his job. His wife divorces him. and he has to contend with what it is to go from the perspective of being in a dominant racial ethnicity and culture to one that is a minority, and what that means in terms of becoming other. And certainly, I think it's important for anyone in a dominant culture to try to understand how our culture makes someone other and what it might be in terms of marginalization or real physical danger in becoming other and being designated as other. In our discussion, there is a short video on the uncanny valley and what it is. And in the uncanny valley, the more realistic and human robots appear to be, the more it freaks us out and reminds us of our own impermanence and maybe our own uselessness to a society that is all about technology. And I'm going to have you also look at a video of a robot made by artist Jordan Wolfson that has some human qualities and some obvious robot qualities to it, as it sensually dances and entices us, also is clearly not human at the same time. And I want you to take a look at what this feeling of the uncanny valley is. And then I'd like to know, in your last thoughts in our class, what did you find most meaningful in our 15 chapters that we went over? So that will be the conclusion of our class. I hope you had a good time. I hope that you found going through this material meaningful the way that I find it very meaningful to go through it every single semester of the last decade of my life, where I play and replay this class over and over and over, and I find it more profound every single time I go through it, and I make more and more connections that I missed the previous times I went through it. And I hope that you will do that also too, is even though you're not taking the class, to try to take the opportunity to consider and internalize and consume this media as much as you can. You know as well as I do, the more you see your favorite movie, read your favorite book over and over again, the more you learn about it. Hope you had a good time in this class. Thank you for joining me in the class, and I'm looking forward to your thoughts on the materials. Bye, everyone.